guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. Today I wanted to talk to you guys about what it's like to live with complex PTSD and also to share my experience on how to deal with deep-seated trauma. So to give you a very brief history of my own past experience, I was raised by a mother who is, as far as I can tell, narcissistic, which meant that essentially being raised by someone like that means that you undergo regular, constant psychological and emotional torture. And her ability to form close attachments with her kids, of course, was compromised because essentially she doesn't have the normal range of human emotions available to her. My parents divorced when I was 2, and my mother definitely tried to ensure that we had very little relationship with our father. And being the youngest kid, I was the last child at home after my older brothers went off and either went to university or got jobs. So being the last kid at the age of 13, my mother decided to kidnap me and take me to the opposite end of the country. I was cut off from all friends and family. I wasn't allowed to tell my father where I was or give him a phone number because my mother was always moving house. I went to a total of 11 schools before I finished high school. At one of those schools, one of the kids threatened to set fire to me, and at a different school, another kid shot me. Although in all fairness, he wasn't actually aiming for me, he was trying to shoot my dog. I just decided that was not happening. That kid had some issues. Later on I found out that he shot and killed the teacher's cat. After leaving home, I had some very toxic friendships and I had a few very toxic relationships. In that particular period of time, I also had a mosquito-borne virus known as Ross River, and it basically meant that I had the flu for 4 months and then had chronic fatigue for 2 years. And at the same time that I was living with an abusive guy and recovering from a virus, my mum also had cancer and was trying to support her through that. So it's kind of unsurprising that during that time I was diagnosed with clinical depression and put onto serotonin replacement. And the general cascade of mental issues and physiological issues was kind of an ongoing thing for about 10 years. One of the things that I've had since I was, I think, about 12 is essential tremors. So that's essentially a nervous system disorder, and I'll, have that for life. It's exacerbated by anxiety and stress in general, and so I do have beta blocker tablets to deal with that. So that's a brief overview of my history. It's not particularly comprehensive, there's more, but I don't think it's really necessary to go in too deep with that. Like, everyone has things that they've dealt with in life, shitty experiences. There's all kinds of different trauma that you can experience, from being bullied at school to essentially being bullied by your parents to actual physical threats to your survival. In a lot of ways, I would say that I have definitely been luckier than some, and I don't think that being luckier or having slightly less trauma necessarily makes things easier. Like, I wouldn't say to someone who maybe hasn't been kidnapped by their parent that oh well, if you haven't been kidnapped by your parent, then I guess you just haven't been through enough trauma. Like, it doesn't really work like that. This particular subject is coming up for a lot of people at the moment because essentially we are living through a mass traumatic event. I don't even need to remind you what event that is. because whether you have been directly affected by illness or not, it's kind of irrelevant because everyone is currently being affected by the other aspects of what's going on, which is largely economic. And I think a lot of the time people underestimate how bad economic stress is. So we're currently living through a situation of mass trauma, which we haven't really seen the likes of since the 1930s and 1940s. But the events that went on back then were felt for generations, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be felt for generations. In fact, the effects of generational trauma have been well researched and well documented. There was a 30-year study done by Columbia University. I'll link that in the description box below so you can check it out. But basically, it was a study which looked at the risk factor of a parent having depression and the child having depression, but it didn't just look at that, it looked at grandparents as well. And the study found that the risk factor for kids to inherit depression from either a grandparent or a parent were the same, and it was about 3 times the average. Duke University did another study which was on starvation, and it's kind of based on observations that were made during the Second World War. Again, I will link that study in the description box so you can have a read through that. But they found that epigenetics, a generation which had gone through starvation, meant that the children born to that generation and the children after that generation were all affected by the starvation. It changed their genetic expression. So whenever you have large traumatic events, whether it's physiology or psychology, it's usually seen and continuously manifested for about 2 generations afterwards. So not only can you inherit mental health problems up to 2 generations ago, but you can also experience trauma in your early childhood which you don't actually remember because you haven't learned language or episodic memory. Again, if you want more information on this, I will link my sources in the description box. Maybe I should just say that instead of saying for every single one. I'll put links in the description box and you can read through everything that I've read through, or most of it. So there's different types of memory. There's things like procedural memory, which is the official term for like muscle memory, where you just do something physically without thinking about it. And then there is declarative memory, which is like an umbrella term for semantic memory and also episodic memory. Semantic memory is being able to recall facts, so it's kind of like learning by rote. And episodic memory is your personal anecdotes, so it's the memories of what you have lived through. And in the case of regular PTSD, which most people are familiar with, that's usually based around one particular event of which you usually have episodic memory. But the problem is that you don't really start developing episodic memory until after the age of 2, and even then it might not be so good until after the age of 7. So before the age of 7, you might have had some traumatic events which you can't actually recall. So what happens to those memories? What happens to those traumatic events? Do you just forget them and move on? Because that's kind of what people assumed for a very long time, especially parents. Like, generally speaking, if you talk to a lot of parents from like the baby boomer years, they're always like, oh yeah, I used to hit my kids, they don't remember it, so it's fine. But the research that psychologists have done over the last, 30 or 40 years would suggest that even though children don't have episodic memory of an event, doesn't mean that it just disappears and that they completely forget about it. So what does happen to a memory if you're not consciously aware of it and if you can't actually recall it? What happens if you can't express something through language? Well, in those situations, the memory exists within the body and it exists within your emotions. Because at the time that it happened, or perhaps in the way that you tried to process it or deal with it, even as an adult, it might not be a conscious memory, it might not be a lucid memory, it might only be in the realm of a physical manifestation or an emotional manifestation. So this is where complex PTSD comes in, and it's called complex PTSD because essentially what it is a whole bunch of micro traumas or smaller traumatic events that just are a giant clusterfuck. And you carry around this unconscious clusterfuck of trauma and you are unable to deal with it because you're not consciously aware of its existence. And instead of coming through as traditional flashbacks, which have like auditory and visual and physical memories attached to them, it comes through as emotional memories. So the usual PTSD is someone comes back from war, they have constant nightmares about the battlefield, or they have flashbacks to being shot at, and they have a specific memory that is attached to that particular trauma. With complex PTSD, there is no specific memory attached to the trauma. The entire existence of the person is attached to trauma. And the flashbacks that you get are not necessarily auditory and visual. I mean, they might be depending on what else you've experienced at the same time. But generally, you will just have overwhelming emotional responses that are not related to the current situation and not appropriate for the current situation. Or you might have physiological responses to stress. So if you are repressing your emotions and you're fairly successful with that, then you'll probably have all kinds of physical issues, like health issues. And the way that the body expresses emotional dysregulation is quite many and varied. So it can be various different aches and pains, such as lower back pain, neck and shoulder pain, bruxism, so grinding your teeth in your sleep, insomnia, breathing difficulties like asthma, problems with your throat and your voice, being numbed or being fatigued, headaches, migraines, allergies, chemical sensitivities, lowered immunity, stomach problems, bowel problems, skin irritations. Like literally your body has to put this particular response or energy somewhere, and it ends up having to do it in things that are quite disruptive to your life, because first of all, it's trying to get your attention. And so your body will try and get your attention through ailments and other physical manifestations of things that you're not dealing with. But also it's trying to purge the emotions. That's like the physical ailment side of things. But there is also the more difficult to pin down psychological response to things. Okay, so we have 4 basic fear responses, or in other words, responses to threats to our safety. Most people are only familiar with the first 2, which is fight and flight. Some people have heard of freeze, but not many people have heard of the 4th one, which is fawning. So that is fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So these 4 different responses, if we were in the wild and it was an acute incidence of threat to our safety, then these 4 things could be employed to save our lives. For example, the fight response could be used to maybe punch a shark in the gills and swim away. The flight response would be to run away from a tiger. You might freeze when you see a poisonous snake and the snake will just pass you by because it only really responds to movement. And then fawning, it's kind of hard to say in wild responses, but essentially it's kind of like playing dead, but in more human terms it would kind of be like talking down a very angry person from like this level to this level. So these are situations which are short-term, high stress, acute potential trauma. And so those 4 responses are appropriate for those situations. But the problem that you often have when you grow up with complex PTSD is that you never really stop employing survival mode techniques for situations where it's not appropriate. So there is a huge difference between acute trauma and acute stress, which is just like a one-off thing. It's very quick, it's over with quite fast, and it doesn't persist into the long term. And that sort of thing is the classical PTSD that most people are familiar with. But complex PTSD is more like chronic trauma, where it just doesn't end for years. And some people might not really have a break from constant stress or constant trauma for decades. And because they haven't had a break from stress, they've never really learnt to employ coping mechanisms that are actually healthy for them. Because in all seriousness, like, what are you supposed to do if you are a very small child who does not have the option of defending yourself or running away? Our basic survival mechanisms are not supposed to be for situations within the family and situations within the community, because that is fucked up. That is a severe dysfunction of society when that's present. We are a social species which is supposed to be able to live harmoniously within family groups and within community groups. And when the family unit and the community unit are fundamentally dysfunctional, our psyche is not really built to deal with that, because essentially that is not supposed to happen. Our family and our community are supposed to be places of safety and security for us, so that we have the opportunity to grow up in a functional way. Because if you don't grow up in a functional way, then you actually become easier prey for vampiric people and vampiric organizations. People who are like that, and organizations that are run by people who are like that, they know what some people have lacked in their upbringing, and so they pretend to offer fulfillment in those areas. And then once they've drawn people in who are desperate to find security and acceptance and safety and love, then they proceed to use and abuse them further. So the last thing you should ever do if you have basically suffered from complex PTSD or even regular PTSD is to try and find someone who will save you. That's a task that you have to take on yourself. You essentially have to reparent yourself, because if you don't, you will continue to be subjected to trauma. Okay, well, this is a cheerful subject, but I guess we should go through the checklist of what chronic PTSD looks like in terms of psychological symptoms. So these are based on the 4 fear responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So these responses are not just like one response and that's the only one that you experience. You'll generally experience like a combination, or you might actually have just episodes of one of them. For example, the fight response. Like when I was on serotonin replacement and clinically depressed, I would occasionally get road rage. So predominantly I was depressed, but then occasionally I was enraged. Fight is a fairly obvious one. This is when people suffer from like road rage, or if they're always seeking conflict, or if they happen to be very defiant. Sometimes with this one, it's just generally being a little bit prickly or a little bit distant, or perhaps slightly combative with people in their life. So the flight response is quite an interesting one. Most of the time you're not even necessarily aware that you're responding in this particular way. Sometimes it's obvious because people who are in flight mode will generally have like itchy feet. They don't want to stay somewhere, they don't want to be stuck somewhere. These are people who are always looking for an escape route of some sort, and sometimes if you're physically grounded but you're in a flight response, you will end up resorting to escapism. So you might read too much, watch too much TV, indulge in substance abuse, all kinds of escapism. You might be addicted to porn or addicted to video games. So addiction is a big one in that particular response, but also anxiety, because having that pent up wanting to run away energy tends to make you pretty anxious. The freeze response is generally associated with depression, but depression is kind of like a clusterfuck of different things. The freeze aspect would be the numbness. So it's that sort of inability to feel anything and inability to be motivated. You have no motivation to look after yourself or to do anything with your life. You could have fatigue. You might not be able to take care of yourself very well. This can also manifest in anxiety, but in particular probably more the agoraphobic side of things, where you just don't want to interact with people, so like social anxiety, or avoiding having to leave your house. And then fawning, the last one, is all about people pleasing. Fawning is when you tend to deflect a lot of attention away from yourself and onto other people, so you'll end up kind of living in service to others, and you might find that you end up living in service to absolute tyrants. You might be avoiding attention in a lot of ways, and you'll tend to give away a lot of your energy. So all of these fear responses, the 4 Fs, are really detrimental to your life. Mostly because they're only supposed to be short-term stopgaps to acute life-threatening situations, not to long-term toxic chronic situations. And so resorting to the fear response when faced with problems usually increases the instability in your life and then perpetuates the problem. So for example, you'll stay in bad situations, you'll give away a lot of your wealth, your health tends to suffer, and you generally just don't function very well. You don't function like a well-rounded individual who grew up in a very stable environment. You've learned to survive, but you haven't learned to function. But usually the problem is you're in a constant state of being triggered emotionally, and you can't logically reason with yourself as to why you're being triggered in that way. Because as I said, unlike regular PTSD, where you have context to put with the response in the form of like flashbacks of the incident, all you have in chronic PTSD is the flashback of emotions. So instead of responding to the current situation for what it is, you're responding to the current situation compounded by everything else you have ever experienced in your life being funneled down into this one moment in time and overwhelming you. So the response is disproportionate. And the only way to stop having these excessive responses to situations is to work on the original traumas. you have to be able to figure out how and why you learnt these particular responses which seemed appropriate for certain situations. So, for example, I get very distressed by people becoming angry around me, whether that anger is directed towards me or directed towards something else. I see that as a threatening situation to me, even though it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with me, simply because when I was very young, being raised by my unstable mother, I learned that if she was angry, I would be punished, regardless of whether it was to do with me or not. So my response to someone else becoming angry around me is learned behavior to try and diffuse a situation which I see as threatening to my safety, because when I was a kid, it was a threat to my safety. And so I have to recognize that I have that response, and I also have to recognize that it's not necessarily appropriate. And then I need to deal with the emotions that are attached to it. I essentially have to interrupt my own survival response and start reasoning with myself. Which doesn't mean that I necessarily have to put up with people being angry around me. Like, that's not necessarily okay. And recognizing that you don't necessarily benefit from staying in toxic situations is kind of important. You have to practice self-care, and you have to shift your focus onto your own health and well-being. Because if you don't, it affects all of your relationships for the rest of your life, and you might be passing it on to your kids. Okay guys, hopefully that was helpful. If you want to leave comments down below, then you can do that. If you don't want to leave comments below, I totally understand. But if you did find this video helpful, then go ahead and share it, hit the like button, and if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe. Okay, take care in these crazy times, and I will see you next time. Bye.